Welcome to Dream or a Night, everyone. The place where we come together to listen, to unwind, and to drift gently into that sweet, peaceful sleep we all crave. I'm Daniel, your host tonight, and oh, how grateful I am that you've chosen to spend this quiet evening with us. Thank you so much for being here. And then, the king himself, crown heavy, heart heavier, walked into the Esagila, Marduk's temple so vast and layered and impossible, a mountain built by human hands that made later travelers whisper, "No, mortals could never." There, in the trembling hush, the high priest performed the ritual that still gives me chills. He stripped the king of every symbol of power, every ring, every necklace, every thread of purple, and struck him across the face hard enough to draw real tears. If the king wept, if those tears rolled down the royal cheek, the omen was good. The god had accepted him. The year was blessed. And when the tears came, the roar that went up must have shaken the stars. The king received his scepter again, eyes still wet, and led the procession out to the Akitu house beyond the walls. And in that moment, the entire year clicked into perfect, glorious order. Babylon never whispered when it could shout, never built small when it could build impossible. Right beside Marduk's temple rose the stepped tower, later ages called Anunnaki, the house that is the foundation of heaven and earth. Its fired bricks climbing so high, it felt like a visible ladder between dirt and stars. Generation after generation rebuilt it after every flood, every war, every earthquake, because that tower screamed to the universe. This city is the axis. This city is aligned. This city is where heaven touches earth. Visitors must have fallen to their knees. The courts, the chanting, the king freshly humbled and recrowned standing before Marduk's statue, while the epic roared around them into tears. History itself tilting on its axis right in front of their eyes. And the wildest part, none of this erased the old gods. It simply rearranged the furniture of heaven. Enki became Ea, but stayed the thoughtful counselor. Still the patron of every clever craft and quiet mercy. Inanna blazed on as Ishtar, brilliant, dangerous, the goddess who could hand a city unstoppable power one day and turn the tide of war the next. Utu strode the sky as Shamash, sunlight and justice in one blazing package. Nana poured silver nights as Sin, Nergal and Ereshkigal kept their thrones of shadow below. The word Anunnaki still thundered, great assembly, but the center of gravity had slid south. The decisions now flowed through Babylon's divine court, like blood through a new heart. Politics outside the temple echoed the myth so perfectly it gives you goosebumps. Hammurabi's laws stood in perfect columns beneath that famous relief. The king, receiving a rod and ring straight from Shamash's hand, shouted to every judge, every merchant, every trembling litigant, "Justice has a source. Justice has style. Justice is not random." Canals were dredged deeper. Storehouses counted to the last grain. Fields resurveyed the second the floodwaters pulled back, because order on earth had to match order in heaven. When Babylon faltered, other powers stepped in and borrowed the same playbook. The Kassites swept in, adopted Marduk like a beloved son, treated the city as sacred trust. The Assyrians up north lifted their own god Ashur sky high and wrote epics where Ninurta or Ashur played Marduk's dragon-slaying role. Yet when they conquered Babylon, they still staged elaborate reconciliations and restorations, because that city's theology carried a legitimacy no army on Earth could forge. Texts from this electric era show the new arrangement breathing at every level. Incantations, calling Marduk and Ea, together healer and wise counselor in one breath. Scholars compiling omen series so massive, the night sky felt like a glowing bulletin board straight from the gods. Priests turning temple inventories into literal encyclopedias of offerings, gate guardians, household rituals, scribal schools copying Enuma Elish until every teenager could recite Marduk's 50 names in their sleep, because memorizing those titles was itself an act of worship. Kings rebuilding walls after siege buried foundation deposits that named Marduk the one who lets brick and timber meet again, and you can almost hear the relief in the clay. The Tablet of Destinies, that flickering symbol from older myth, now blazes with new clarity. In Assyrian and Babylonian battle stories, victory always returns the tablet to its rightful owner, because without it, no command, no crown, no conquest truly holds. The lesson rings like a bell across centuries. Legitimacy matters as much as raw force. A city can win every battle and still lose the year if heaven hasn't signed the paperwork. This new theology wasn't just pretty stories, it was statecraft wearing cosmic clothes. Babylon framed Marduk not as a distant smiter, but as the god who sets calendars, assigns posts, names every star, restores cities brick by brick, the perfect model for an empire that needed a center that could organize, repair, endure. Priests singing his titles were really preaching to king and commoner alike. A real ruler doesn't just command. He cleans up, he fixes, he remembers that one silted canal can starve a district for a year. Lay the older Sumerian tablets beside this Babylonian library and you see continuity and revolution dancing cheek to cheek. Humans still born from divine blood and earthly clay, just a new culprit, a new patron. The divine council keeps its ancient shape but quietly rearranges the seating chart. The me, those shining gifts that make culture spin, are folded into Marduk's 50 names like jewels into a crown. Festivals once scattered across dozens of proud centers now march in one glorious river toward Babylon. One ritual parade carrying the entire year on its shoulders. The map is redrawn, yet every beloved landmark still stands. In daily life, merchants and farmers walk through gates named for gods famous from the Gulf to the Mediterranean. Counted days by a calendar that matched epic and sky. Took disputes to judges sitting beneath reliefs of Shamash and swore oaths that called both Anunnaki and Marduk to witness. No wonder later ages remembered Babylon as the very idea of city. The place where power and learning kissed under starlight. The rise of Marduk didn't just glorify one god, it handed every generation after a brand new script for telling their own story of change. Assyrian kings carved triumphs on palace walls and borrowed dragon-slaying, world-ordering imagery without shame. Persian satraps managed riverlands and quietly adopted every administrative trick Babylon had perfected. Seleucid and Parthian scholars plotted planets with tables born in the same temple complexes, where priests once chanted Enuma Elish every spring. By the end of this long, breathtaking chapter, the Anunnaki have not vanished. Oh no. They've been absorbed into a larger, glittering imperial vision. They remain the old powers, whispering in the background, while a younger champion stands center stage. Spotlight, blazing. The gods of Sumer are now the cabinet of Babylon, their ancient authority flowing through one single dazzling office. Their festivals feed one single procession that carries the weight and joy of the entire year on its shoulders. If the Sumerians invented the first trembling template of an ordered cosmos, the Babylonians took that template, wrote the manual in fire and gold, and stamped it with the royal seal. Ask a sunburned Sumerian farmer who the Anunnaki were, and he'd squint up at the sky and say, "The High Family, the ones who decide everything from up there." Ask his great-great-grandson sweating under the walls of late Babylon, and he might lower his voice and whisper, "They sit in the dark now, passing judgment on the dead." Same mighty name, brand new job description. One of those slow, quiet cultural turns that sneaks up on you line by line in hymns and oaths and laments, until one day you wake up and the old council of heaven is just as much a court below. And the journey that took them there begins, of course, in story. Because everything important always does. Picture-proud, radiant Inanna, Queen of Uruk, deciding one day to visit the underworld ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. She marches down, 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 passing 7 gates, leaving a piece of her regalia, a piece of her power, at every single one, until she stands utterly stripped before the law of death itself. There, waiting in the gloom, sit 7 Anunnaki as judges, faces like stone, eyes older than sorrow. They do not bargain, they do not debate, they simply look at her and pronounce sentence. Inanna is struck dead, hung on a hook like discarded meat, until clever rescue from above drags her gasping back to daylight. The point is not cruelty, the point is ice-cold certainty. The world below has rules as unbreakable as the ones above, and the same ancient powers who once set fates on high now guard the boundaries so the dead stay where they belong. Other texts echo the shift like funeral bells. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the heroes speak with trembling voices of the Anunnaki who decree death and now dwell beside Ereshkigal in the dust. Incantations against illness and curses list the Anunnaki among the chthonic powers you beg to witness oaths and punish liars even after the grave closes. Hittite treaties from the cold highlands call them in as underworld enforcers. That proud skyborn title becomes the name you whisper when you want a promise to hold even after the heart stops beating. Scribes in the first millennium started using a neat pairing: Igigi for the bright gods of open sky, Anunnaki for the gods beneath. The words didn't appear from nowhere. They reflect a slow, deliberate sorting of the pantheon to fit a world of empire and archives. Heaven fills with blazing signs for scholars to read by lamplight. The depths fill with judges and wardens keeping the dead in perfect, terrible order. The arrangement is so tidy it would make any Mesopotamian heart sing, because neatness was always next to godliness here. To understand why this mattered, you have to picture the Mesopotamian afterlife. And oh, it is not a meadow of flowers. It is a dim, dusty house called Kur or Arali, where the dead live as shades eating dust and drinking muddy water, unless the living remember them with love and offerings. The road down leads through 7 gates guarded by doorkeepers who know your name. Across the river Huber, where a silent boatman ferries you for a coin pressed under your tongue, and into a grey city ruled by grim Ereshkigal, with fierce Nergal at her side. In some traditions there are officials, scribes, bureaucracy below just like above, because even death needs paperwork. And presiding over it all, A court. The Anunnaki. Burial customs grew straight out of that heartbreaking belief. Families poured beer and cool water for ancestors at set times, brought bread and dates, called the names of the dead aloud so the shades would feel fed and gentle instead of hungry and angry. Tablets we group under the name Kispu lay out the offerings in careful lists. Other tablets warn in chilling detail what happens when the chain breaks. A neglected ghost rises restless, slips through cracks, troubles the house with sickness and nightmares. But there were rituals for that too, thank the gods. Priests burned juniper until the smoke stung your eyes, spoke the names of underworld powers, and begged the Anunnaki themselves to judge the case and send the spirit home. Graves tell the same story in clay and gold and heartbreak. In the royal cemetery at early in the tradition, the mighty went down accompanied by lyres, gold leaves fluttering like captured sunlight, carnelian beads glowing like embers, oxen and attendants in pageants so lavish they look insane until you understand the logic. To live well below, you needed at least a fraction of what you loved above. Later, burials are quieter, but almost always include bowls, lamps, small tools. Because these are not random keepsakes, they are love letters to the journey every soul must make. And overseeing it all, making sure the dead stay where they belong and the living keep their promises, sit the Anunnaki, the same ancient council that once ruled the sky, now guardians of the final, unbreakable boundary. Oh, hold me, because those little bowls, those tiny lamps, those humble tools tucked into graves were never random keepsakes. They were love letters, desperate, aching love letters slipped into the hand of every traveller on the one journey nobody escapes. Can you feel the tenderness that carved them? The mother who pressed a cup into cold fingers whispering, "Drink when you're thirsty down there." The father who added a chisel because his son should never be without the means to build. Every single grave good was a shout across the abyss. You are not forgotten, you are still ours. And the Anunnaki, they show up in legal texts like the sternest grandparents you ever feared disappointing. Those Kassite and Babylonian boundary stones, those gorgeous, terrifying Kuduru stones, stand there carved with gods and symbols, screaming curses at anyone foolish enough to move a marker or fake a land grant. Listen to the curses roll like thunder. May the Anunnaki of earth and sky blind the offender. May they cut off his seed forever. May they turn his proud house into a heap of ruin. It sounds brutal, I know, but in a land where every canal-fed field was the thin line between feast and famine, property lines were survival lines. Respect the edge of your neighbour's barley, and the courts above smiled. Cross it, steal it, lie about it, and the courts below. Those same ancient Anunnaki were waiting with ledgers open and eyes that never blink. Justice didn't stop at the grave. It followed you all the way down. And when cities fell, when cities fell, the laments still rip my heart out 3,000 years later. Poets stood in the rubble and sang long, keening songs about patron gods packing up and walking away, gates torn from hinges, sacred fires burning in courtyards where children once danced. They weren't performing for applause, they were pleading, begging the deepest authorities in the universe to reverse the verdict. Every lament ended with the same trembling hope. Come back, soften your hearts, great Anunnaki, and let the gods return. When a new ruler finally scraped together the courage and silver to rebuild a temple, He buried a tablet at the foundation like a time capsule of desperation. Anunnaki! Watch these walls! Curse anyone who dares tear them down again. Because even rebuilding was an appeal to the highest court. The underworld court shows up everywhere, even in the rituals that scrubbed away bad luck before it could harden into doom. Those Namburbi texts handbooks for undoing nightmares read like ancient panic buttons. If a crack in your wall looked like a bad omen, if a dog howled 3 times at midnight, the ritual told you exactly what to burn, what to bury, which gods to call, so the sign wouldn't ripen into fate. And guess who was part of that cosmic machinery? The underworld powers, the Anunnaki themselves. Once they wrote a decision in their unbreakable ink, it stood forever. Want to stop disaster? You had to act before the ink dried, and the mindset was so legal, so beautifully bureaucratic, it makes you laugh and cry at the same time. Then the dark realm gains detail, and one terrifying couple rises. Nergal, fierce lord of plague and war, and Ereshkigal, queen of the place where the sun never shines. Myths tell of his rough, passionate courtship and his descent to her throne. And even though he wasn't Anunnaki by birth in the old lists, there he is, sitting right beside them on the bench of judges. Titles shifted as duties grew. New officials pulled up chairs because empire needed a full staff, and the old family name simply stretched to cover the whole grim courtroom. And 7-0. 7 is everywhere. 7 gates you strip at on the way down. 7 judges who stare into your soul. 7 decrees that cannot be appealed. The number had magic weight across all Mesopotamia. It organized festivals, lists, everything. To pass 7 checkpoints was to pass the complete test. To face 7 judges was to face the full, merciless court. In spells and hymns, naming the 7 Anunnaki of the underworld was the ultimate power move. You were saying, I've consulted every authority that matters, and I'm not taking no for an answer. By the late first millennium, scribes were cataloguing like their lives depended on it, and maybe they did. Scholarly tablets list underworld beings with a neatness that almost hides the terror pulsing underneath. Threshold demons with teeth like lions, storm spirits hunting the wicked, recorded names for judges who hear suits filed by the dead themselves. And right there among them, still carrying their ancient gravitas, the Anunnaki. A learned priest could unroll a tablet, speak the right names in the right order, and fit the ritual to any nightmare like a key in a lock. But here's what always stops me cold. This turn from heaven to below never erased the older memory. You still hear hymns to Enlil thundering that he sets fates on high. You still find prayers to Shamash begging for justice in broad daylight. The difference is heartbreakingly simple. A complete world needed guardians everywhere. If an oath was broken in the open, Shamash's son would burn the liar's shadow. But if guilt hid and the wrongdoer slipped into the grave still smirking, the court below was waiting. Justice might take a year or a lifetime, but someone would record it, and the senior judges, the Anunnaki, would have their say. It helped that the cities themselves were living sermons on impermanence. One season a quarter bustled with children and bakeries. The next a flood laid sterile clay across it like a shroud. New kings moved capitals and left proud temples to crumble into sad, beautiful ruins. Families clutched tablets of property and marriage contracts. But every spring and every war season taught the same brutal lesson. Nothing lasts untouched. So of course they imagined a final ledger kept in a place that fire and flood could never reach. The Anunnaki became the clerks and judges of that ledger, and when you stand back and squint, you see the most graceful evolution imaginable. An old title that refused to die because it was simply too useful. Once they were the High Family, shining in the bright court of heaven. Later, they were the senior bench below, and the thread stitching both lives together was the one thing Mesopotamia could never live without: order. A world that began with the dramatic separation of sky and earth needed guardians on both sides of the seam, didn't it? The people of Sumer and Akkad, Babylon and Assyria, watched their rivers rise and fall, counted their days with trembling care, and had to trust that judgments made in the right names could hold an entire country together when everything else was sliding into chaos. The Anunnaki, whether seated among the stars or in the dust below, supplied those names, and for nearly 2,000 years, the names of An, Enlil, and Anunna faded to a whisper no louder than desert wind sifting through broken brick. Temples that once blazed with cedar smoke and song became gentle hills of compacted clay. The rivers themselves wandered off to new beds. New kings raised new shrines to new gods, and the scripts, the beautiful, impossible wedge scripts that held the memory of Sumer and Akkad, drifted out of use until no living eye could read a single sign. The old stories went to sleep under the sand, dreaming in the dark. A few ancient writers kept tiny sparks alive. A Babylonian priest named Berossus wrote in Greek during the 3rd century before the Common Era, and later authors quoted his fragments like precious crumbs. He told of creation from watery beginnings, of a great flood, of the first cities on the lower rivers, and for centuries that was all anyone had, just rumours of rumours. Roman authors barely glanced at the clay archives. Medieval travellers saw only strange mounds and broken masonry reused in village walls. Local farmers called the ruins the houses of the kings and shrugged. No one could name the kings anymore. But then, oh then, curiosity sharpened by empire and a hunger for proof woke the past with a roar. In the late 18th century, a Danish surveyor named Carsten Niebuhr stood in the blazing Persian sun and copied those strange wedge signs from monuments like he was copying messages from another planet. Scholars in Europe pounced, compared, argued into the night, and slowly realized, this isn't decoration, this is writing. Early in the next century, a German schoolmaster named Georg Friedrich Grotefend took a wild, brave guess at a few royal names in the simplest version of the script. And he was right often enough to set hearts on fire. The script came in several flavours, and the old Persian version gave the first toehold because king lists from Greek historians matched the names. But the other forms were older, far older, and they belonged to a world nobody dreamed still had a voice. The key hung high on a cliff in western Iran at Behistun, where Persian King Darius had ordered his glory carved in 3 languages, like a taunt to the future. In the 1840s, an officer named Henry Rawlinson, part mountaineer, part madman, all genius scaled that rock face with ropes and nerves of steel, copying wedge signs while the wind howled and the sun baked him alive. The old Persian text could be read first, and like a master key, it unlocked the Akkadian and Elamite versions beside it. One doorway opened, then another, until within decades scholars were reading Akkadian, the language that carried the literature of Assyria and Babylon, and the dead script began to speak again. Excavation exploded at the same time. In the 1840s, Paul Emile Botta dug at Khorsabad and sent Europe reeling with palaces of carved stone and winged bulls that still make you catch your breath. Austen Henry Layard attacked Nimrud and Nineveh, shipping whole slabs of reliefs to London while uncovering the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal shelves upon shelves of clay tablets, notes, copies, hymns, epics, arranged by subject like the world's first research library. The British Museum and others began to overflow with brittle rectangles that smelled of 3,000-year-old dust. Reading followed digging, and every translation was a resurrection. In 1872, a young museum assistant named George Smith pieced together a broken tablet and realized, hands shaking, that he was holding a flood story older than Genesis itself. When he reached the part where the hero releases birds to test the receding waters, legend says he leapt up in the reading room and ran through the halls shouting for joy. His translation dragged the Epic of Gilgamesh into daylight and proved the myths of the lower rivers could still reach across millennia and grab us by the heart. The same libraries gave us Atrahasis, with its gods on strike, and humans born to carry baskets, the descent of Ishtar, the Sumerian king list, countless prayers and rituals that made the air feel thick with incense again. Slowly, reverently, the word Anunnaki began to appear in footnotes, then in main text, as scholars learned exactly where it belonged. Another stream of discovery opened farther south. In the 1880s, the University of Pennsylvania sent an expedition to Nippur, the old sacred city, and found vast temple ruins and tablet layers so deep you could lose generations in them. Those tablets proved Akkadian wasn't the only language of the old literature. Behind it lay Sumerian, a language with no known relatives, preserved because later scribes loved traditions so fiercely they copied old hymns and myths like school exercises. As Sumerian grammar surrendered its secrets, a more ancient picture swam into focus. Names once known only in Akkadian dress stepped out in their original Sumerian beauty. Inanna behind Ishtar, Enki before Ea, and the term Anuna, the princely seed, finally explained the Akkadian Anunnaki. The new science needed a name, and Assyriology was born because the first jaw-dropping finds were Assyrian. But the beating heart lay in the whole sweeping arc of Mesopotamia. Scholars built the craft from scratch, teaching students to copy signs with monk-like steady hands, to think like scribes pressing reeds into wet clay on a sunny roof 3,000 years ago. They restored sign lists and lexical tables, dated tablets by the graceful flow of the wedges, the way art historians date calligraphy, made concordances so a broken phrase in one copy could be healed by another. And in the early 20th century, the map filled in like a developing photograph. Robert Coldewey dug at Babylon for 18 patient years, tracing the city from the Ishtar Gate, blazing with blue glazed bricks, to the long processional street that led straight to Marduk's temple. Proving a city could be destroyed and reborn on the exact same footprint until the layers rose to the height of a hill. And every shovel of dirt, every translated line, every cracked tablet glued back together was another voice from the dust saying, "We were here, we loved, we feared, we built, And somehow, against all odds, we are still speaking. Oh, picture it with me. Can you feel the desert wind turning cool as the sun drops and the first shovels bite into Ur's royal cemetery in the 1920s and 30s? Sir Leonard Woolley is standing there, pipe clenched between his teeth, eyes wide as the earth gives up its dead like a slow, golden heartbeat. Gold headdresses that still shimmer like captured sunlight. Lyres whose strings have been silent for 4,000 years. Chariots whose wheels once thundered across the plain. And then, oh God, the grim, heartbreaking evidence of those older pageants where attendants walked willingly into death, wearing their finest jewellery. Woolley's trenches slice clean across the site and hit that band of pure river clay, thick, clean, terrifying, proof that some ancient generation looked up one morning and saw the world end in water. His team records every shard, every bead, with a care that sets the gold standard for every dig that follows, because they know they are holding the actual fingerprints of people who loved and feared and sang exactly like we do. And then, as the 20th century roars forward, a generation of absolute giants, Thorkild Jakobsen, with his poet's ear that could hear the gods breathing, Samuel Noah Kramer, with his stubborn, joyful insistence that these weren't dead texts, but living voices. Take those raw clay fragments and turn them into literature that makes you weep on the subway. Jacobson writes about the early gods and the birth of city cults like he's telling you about his own childhood. And Kramer gives us that perfect ringing phrase, history begins at Sumer, and you want to stand up and cheer because it's catchy and it's true. With every new translation, the Anunnaki step clearer into the light. First as the high assembly in Sumerian hymns, the ones who assign destinies like solemn judges in a starlit court. Then later, in the Akkadian chill, as the underworld bench whose eyes never close. They were never a fixed roster carved in stone. No, they were a living, breathing title for the senior circle of divine authority, flexible enough to stretch across centuries and still feel like family. Museums learn to cradle clay like newborns, conservators humming lullabies while they clean tablets with the softest brushes, fitting broken edges together like the most sacred jigsaw puzzle in history. Infrared cameras catch faint wedge marks the naked eye gave up on decades ago, and suddenly a ghost sentence rises from the dust. Scholars map exactly where each tablet was found. A shelf of omen text in one corner, a bundle of incantations by the door, and you can almost smell the incense and hear the anxious priest asking the Anunnaki to guard that boundary stone snarling in roots and salt at the edge of some long-lost field. Archaeology and text hold hands and sing the same song. Those ziggurats at Ur and Uruk towering over the flat plain like God's own front porch. The stepped platforms under Eridu's earliest temples prove Enki's cult is older than memory itself, right where sweet water kisses salt. Nippur's Ekor precinct, risen block by block until you understand why every hymn placed Enlil at the center of everything. And those tiny cylinder seals, no bigger than your thumb, showing a seated deity handing rod and ring to a trembling human, shouting the same message as the law codes and the hymns. Authority is measured, authority is given, never grabbed. Not every find fits neatly, of course it doesn't. For years, scholars argued like family at Thanksgiving over how many Anunnaki there actually were. hundreds split between heaven and earth in one text, a solemn 7 in the underworld in another, until finally the grown-ups in the room said, "Stop forcing one list on century of living faith." The term was a title, a beloved, flexible title that cities and ages wore like a favorite coat. And that, my friends, is exactly what living religions do. They carry a few unbreakable ideas across generations and let the details breathe. By mid-century, the outlines are so clear, you can teach them to undergraduates who lean forward in their seats, like they're hearing the best bedtime story ever. The earliest cities bloom in the Uruk period. Writing starts as humble bean counting and explodes into soul-shaking literature. Sumerian and Akkadian dance together for centuries like old married couples. And the divine household mirrors civic life so perfectly, it gives you chills. The Anunnaki begin as children of Sky Father and Earth Mother, grow into the senior assembly that sets destinies, and later, when empires need judges below as much as above, they slide into those underworld thrones without ever losing their ancient dignity. Outside the ivory towers, the wonder spreads like wildfire. Museum galleries fill with roaring crowds, staring at gate lions and reliefs of kings hunting. Translations of Gilgamesh hit bestseller lists. Teachers hold up a clay tablet and say, "Voice, cracking." Right here a scribe pressed this sign 4,000 years ago, and we can still read what he felt. The distance between us and them shrinks until you can almost smell the cedar smoke. A hymn praising a god for bringing sweet water to parched fields hits you like a memory from your own childhood. And you nod through tears because you watered the garden last July, and you know that gratitude. But the rediscovery isn't one smooth climb. Of course not. Wars rip holes in the story. Collections scatter or burn. Sites erode while politicians argue over permits. Yet the tablets themselves are stubborn as the people who made them. Clay breaks, but it survives fire better than papyrus, better than leather, better than anything. A city that burns leaves behind a baked library. A fallen wall seals a room like a time capsule, and every season teams go back to the dirt. It's like resuming the best conversation you ever had. By the end of the century, walk into any good library and the shelves groan with entire series on Mesopotamian religion. Bilingual editions with transliteration on one page and translation on the next. Dictionaries that untangle Sumerian compounds and Akkadian verbs like patient surgeons. Atlases tracing every twist of the rivers across millennia. In those books, the Anunnaki stand exactly where they belong, not as dusty curiosities, but as the beating heart of how the very first cities organized the unseen. The long silence is over, shattered by a chorus of small, fierce voices on clay telling us about gods and people negotiating work and fate, about councils that set rules, about titles that gathered new duties without ever losing their old majesty, about one ancient word for a royal family that grew into the highest court in every realm. The Anunnaki were lost, and then, against every odd, they were found. Not just as legends, but as lines and seals and bricks you can cradle in your own trembling hands. And most readers, most of us, are content to sit with the poetry, the legal wit, the stubborn practicality of those first cities, and just marvel through tears. But a few hungry souls wanted something more explosive, something that made the hair on their arms stand up. They looked at gods who came from the sky and asked, eyes shining, what if sky means exactly what I think it means? That's how the Anunnaki leapt from quiet seminar rooms into late-night television and the wilder corners of the internet. It started in the 1960s when Erich von Däniken, Swiss hotelier with a taste for wonder, filled pages with breathless questions. Do those old stones show rocket engines? Do those myths describe machines instead of miracles? He bounced from Peru to Egypt to Mesopotamia, pointing and asking, until millions of readers felt like members of a secret cosmic club. Little of it held water, but the hunger, the delicious hunger for something bigger, was real. Then, in the 1970s, Zecharia Sitchin stepped up with a story so grand, it took your breath away. He claimed the Sumerians weren't spinning myths. They were recording literal history from a time when a rogue planet, Nibiru, swept close on its long, cold orbit. Its people were the Anunnaki, gold-hungry visitors who needed our yellow metal to save their atmosphere. They found early primates, saw potential, and Enki, now recast as a white-coated scientist with clay under his nails, mixed divine blood with ape stock and, boom, us. Modern humanity, born in a test tube under alien supervision. He swore the tablet said exactly that if you knew how to read between the wedges. It felt like science with its talk of genes and orbits. Felt like theology with its cosmic purpose. Felt like the greatest detective story ever because only a few special readers could see the clues. Millions bought the books. Millions more whispered the name Anunnaki like a password to the truth. Television producers smelled magic and ran with it. Cameras swooped over ziggurats while narrators with perfect gravitas intoned about ancient astronauts bringing writing and lore. Say Anunnaki, and you were in the club. You knew the enormous secret. Scholars raised polite hands from the back. Nibiru in late texts is just a poetic name for Jupiter or a sky crossing point. Anunnaki means the high gods, not space travelers. Creation from clay is ritual symbolism, not genetic engineering. And a rogue planet would have wrecked every orbit we've measured since Galileo. But the divide only widened when dates got tied to prophecy, and 2012 loomed like a cosmic deadline. Some swore Nibiru was coming home. The old gods stepping off ships onto their platforms again. Astronomers sighed. The patient sigh of kindergarten teachers. There is no rogue planet, folks. Backyard telescopes would have seen it years ago. 2012 came. 2012 went. Same old storms, same old elections, and the tablets sat quietly in their cases, unchanged and unimpressed. Yet the fact that these ideas keep circling back like migratory birds says something so tender about us, doesn't it? We crave meaning on a grand scale, the same way the Mesopotamians did. They found it in a council that set fates, in contracts between gods and cities, in a map where every gate had a guardian and every canal had a prayer. When modern hearts aren't satisfied with slow human work, we sometimes reach for a faster, shinier spark. Aliens become our new divine will. Rockets replace thrones, and the Anunnaki, bless them, fit the frame perfectly because they already carry the weight of every origin story ever whispered around a fire. But there's a third path, a beautiful middle road between cold debunking and breathless belief. And it's the one I beg you to walk with me. This path treats the ancient texts as human documents, as precious blood and sweat human documents that deserve to be read with care and love. And it lets wonder bloom without handing the keys to fantasy. On this path, the flood story isn't proof of alien arcs. It's the raw memory of a land that lived every day with rivers as both generous mothers and murderous strangers. On this path, the Anunnaki aren't astronauts in gold helmets. They are the fierce, wise, quarrelsome family council that helped the very first cities make sense of a world that could feed you one year and drown you the next. And on this path, we get to hold those clay tablets, feel the actual thumbprint of a scribe who died 4,000 years ago, and whisper across the abyss, "I see you, I hear you. Thank you for teaching us how to be human." Because that, my friends, that is the real miracle. Not spaceships, but the unbroken chain of story and wonder that still binds us to the first voices who ever looked at the stars and dared to answer back. Stand with me for a second. Can you feel the hush that falls when you finally hold one of those tablets in your own two hands? The creation of people to carry baskets isn't some cold footnote. It's the most honest, gut-punching thing any civilization ever admitted about itself. We exist because the gods got tired of digging ditches. And when you read that line in a trahasis, you don't laugh at them. You feel the weight of every canal crew that ever sweated under a Mesopotamian sun, because organized labor was sacred and somebody had to shoulder it. The descent to the underworld. That's not horror movie stuff. It's the most tender structure grief ever built. 7 gates, 7 strips of clothing laid down like tears, 7 judges who know your name, because the dead must be kept close, fed by name and offering, or the living can't breathe. The Anunnaki on this path are not spacemen in shiny helmets. They are the fierce, loving, terrifying way a city made sense of power, justice, and the limits we all have to accept if we want to keep living together. And yes, pop culture keeps borrowing them. And maybe, just maybe, that's okay. Because fiction thrives on what if, doesn't it? A novelist who strands an Anunnaki on a lonely shore, staring at the stars with homesick eyes, is writing in the exact same spirit that let a Sumerian poet watch the moon rise and sing of Nana sailing his silver boat across the night. The difference is the shelf you put the book on. Myth can be playful and still stay true to its source. Pseudoscience pretends to be the owner's manual and then begs to be graded on charm alone. But one persistent detour has caused more heat than light, and we have to talk about it because it keeps tripping people up. The idea that the Anunnaki are the sons of God who came down and made giants in the Bible. It's so easy to draw pretty threads if you only match the sound of words and ignore languages, dates, and actual libraries. Ideas do travel flood stories, absolutely did. But Mesopotamian gods are not just Hebrew angels wearing a fake mustache. They have their own zip code, their own smell of canal mud and baked brick, their own heartbeat of barley harvests and levee repairs. Their stories stand tall without any later scaffolding. Thank you very much. Walk back to the tablets after a wild ride through the modern claims, and they feel steadier than ever, don't they? A schoolboy in an old Babylonian classroom scratches that people were made so the gods wouldn't have to dig plain, practical, hilarious, true. A Sumerian hymn lifts its voice to praise Enlil for setting fates like a master architect. A list of offerings records 50 loaves and 10 jugs of beer handed over to the high circle at new moon, because even gods like a party. A Kuduru stone snarls that the Anunnaki will blind and barren any thief who moves a boundary. Because in Canal Country, stealing land is stealing life. None of these lines need a spaceship to make your heart race. They only need a city where everyone understands has to share work and keep promises or collapse. The more you read, the more those modern detours start looking like mirrors for our own hopes and fears. Fear that maybe our science isn't enough. Hope that we're part of a story bigger than our little lifetimes. Those are beautiful, human feelings. And guess what? The ancients had them too. They answered with temples that touched the sky, calendars that turned chaos into seasons, councils that made the universe feel like it had a manager. We answer with telescopes that drink starlight, particle accelerators that chase the first heartbeat of creation. And yes, sometimes with mass-market paperbacks that fly off the shelf faster than loaves at new moon. There's no harm in enjoying an hour of television where someone points at a relief and whispers, perhaps. The harm comes when speculation is sold as translation, and people walk away thinking they've read the owner's manual instead of a campfire tale. The best antidote isn't scolding, it's reading. Read the ration tablet for a canal crew, and then read Atrahasis and feel the same shoulders aching across 4,000 years. Stand in an excavation trench beside a burned bricklayer and then read the lament for a fallen city until you're crying in the same tears. Walk the ghost plan of Uruk, where Inanna's temple once stood, and read her hymn until you swear you can smell her perfume on the wind. The old stories will earn your trust without any help from special effects. In the end, the modern life of the Anunnaki has two branches, and both alive and kicking. In one branch, they are the patient managers of a universe that runs on decree, offering, and beautifully measured time. In the other, they are star travelers who left us a complicated inheritance of freedom and servitude. One branch is backed by mountains of clay and centuries of context. The other by wish, rhetoric, and really good cover art. Both are now part of cultural memory, but only one needs a glossary and a pinch of salt. Once upon a time, Anunnaki was a dusty scholar's term that lived quietly in footnotes and Tuesday night seminars. Then, almost overnight, a minor caste of ancient deities strutted onto the bright stage of modern culture and discovered they could play every role from cosmic mentor to secret overlord. It didn't happen in one season. It was a slow, delicious drift powered by television, paperbacks, message boards, and the irresistible truth that old stories travel best when you give them brand new wheels. First stop, television, that promised cosmic revelations right after the commercial break. Producers figured out that a camera absolutely loves ruins, especially if you swoop past them at sunset with a drumbeat that makes your pulse race. A narrator whispers that the stones hold a secret, flashes a tablet covered in mysterious wedges, and suddenly the same signs that once recorded 50 sheep delivered to Temple Brewery are hinting at interstellar visitors. Scholars had been saying for decades those marks were hymns, laws, grocery lists. The news shows asked, but what if? And the question was the hook that reeled millions in. Episodes multiplied like spring floods. Uruk and Ur became recurring characters. Ziggurats got recast as launch towers, and the word Anunnaki picked up a sparkle it never wore when it was just a line in a hymn. Publishers sprinted to keep up. Glossy paperbacks with dramatic dust jackets, winged kings, cylinder seals blown up to billboard size, star fields swirling behind the title promised the key to the oldest mysteries. Inside, the Anunnaki could be wise teachers, stern geneticists, or a dynasty that never really left. Chapters mixed real photos with captions that nudged you toward brand new meanings, and the method's so simple it's genius. Take a known object, add a provocative gloss, let the reader's imagination light the fuse. Museums felt the earthquake. Visitors showed up armed with questions that leapt across millennia in one breath. A guide starts explaining irrigation on the lower rivers and suddenly finds herself debating a hidden planet beyond Neptune before the group reaches the second display case. The internet flung open 1,000 side doors, early forums where people traded translations, drawings, dreams, amateur archivists scanning century-old articles and posting them with breathless comments. Someone quoting a tablet line, someone else linking to a satellite photo of an Iraqi mound asking, "What's really under there?" Videos stitched stock footage together and opened with the two most dangerous words in English. What if? Cites Wassam. A whole subculture of calm, earnest explainers rose up, the kind who can talk for an hour and almost convince you the sky is lying. Games and fiction jumped in because writers adore a ready-made pantheon. Anunnaki sounds ancient and rich, even if you can't spell Mesopotamia. Game designers borrowed the mood role-playing books listing the Anunnaki as a shadowy ancient faction whose relics grant godlike powers. Sci-fi novels planted hidden bases under desert ziggurats, waiting for a signal after millennia of sleep. Comic artists drew tall, horned-crowned figures stepping from shafts of blinding light while humans shield their eyes. None of it claimed to be history. It was the playful remix myth, has always invited once it escapes the classroom. Music and art grabbed the baton next. Bands named albums after sky fathers. Lyricists wove floods and lost cities into choruses that stadiums screamed back. Tattoo artists learned to translate favourite cuneiform signs into clean, proud lines on skin. Street murals slapped winged figures on brick walls beside spray-painted planets, shouting that the most ancient stories still want to live in modern weather. Pop culture is a giant net that catches whatever glints, and the Anunnaki started glinting like crazy. Conventions turned it social. Hotel ballrooms and community centres filled with slides that zipped from excavation trenches to star charts. Vendors sold paperbacks, replica seals, meteorite fragments the size of hope comes in. In one corner, a retired engineer explained reed boat physics to a wide-eyed teenager. In another, a podcaster recorded interviews about a return date for a planet no observatory ever saw. Part science fair, part revival, part book club. Everyone there chasing the electric thrill of an idea that ties the very first cities to the far future. Museums adapted fast. Curators wrote labels explaining how a scribe actually held the reed stylus. Added panels clarifying that Nibiru in late star lists is just Jupiter being poetic. Trained docents to answer wild questions with kindness and evidence. Some exhibitions staged gentle debates. A flood tablet beside a map of ancient river channels and a photo of a modern levee showing that myth, environment and memory braid together instead of hiding riddle boxes. Schools felt the ripple too. Teachers discovered that a lesson on Mesopotamia packed the room when they acknowledged the pop culture version first, then used that spark to teach how real knowledge works. One day, the kids read a passage from Atrahasis. The next, they're building reed and paper boats to carry grain across a tub of water. Another day, They study a boundary stone and write modern contracts in mock cuneiform. Suddenly, Anunnaki isn't a conspiracy code. It's a doorway straight into the daily, sweaty, beautiful world of barley, brick, and debt. And of course, the wildest corners of the web turned the Anunnaki into masked puppet masters, pulling strings behind elections and stock markets, or fused them with saints, demons, hidden bloodlines. The same old pattern. Take a term dripping with age and authority, rip it from context, let it soak up whatever a moment most fears or craves. In that mode, the Anunnaki become a dark mirror for modern suspicion. And when institutions let us down, a story about unseen hands feels like an answer, even if it leaves you more anxious than before. Yet right alongside all the noise, a quieter, stronger current has been growing. Independent translators posting side-by-side hymns so anyone can compare. Digital projects building searchable corpora where you type one word and watch it light up across centuries of tablets. Documentary crews sweating in the field with archaeologists, showing how 1 square meter of dirt can cough up 3 tablets that rewrite a king's reign. In these works, the Anunnaki slide gracefully back into their original roles. First, the highest council that sets destinies. Later, the somber judges below, and the drama is still there. But it belongs to a living, breathing discipline that can look you in the eye and say, clear as canal water, when a claim fits the clay, and when it's just smoke. And that, my friends, is the most beautiful resurrection of all. If there's ever been a single reason why the Anunnaki have carved out this permanent, almost unshakable spot in our collective imagination, it's because they feed 2 hungers at the same exact moment. And oh man, do they feed them well? On one hand, they give us the intoxicating romance of the very first cities, those breathtaking processions winding through the streets, the soaring ziggurat towers that scrape the heavens, the glittering offerings laid out in gold and lapis under a merciless sun. Can you picture it? On the other hand, they hand us a cosmic script that's infinitely rewritable, like the most deliciously open source mythology ever created. You get to decide, are they benevolent guardians watching over humanity's cradle, or cold-hearted tyrants who treated us like disposable labor? Were they patient teachers who gifted us civilization, or ruthless creditors who came to collect a debt we never agreed to pay? Isn't that flexibility absolutely wild? That very adaptability is what let the word Anunnaki survive century after century, as its job description shifted from gods of the shining sky down to grim judges in the underworld. And guess what? That same flexibility is exactly what lets the term rocket through modern movies, memes, podcasts, and late-night conspiracy threads, sometimes buried in a footnote, sometimes screaming across a headline, sometimes vanishing again, only to resurface somewhere else. Sure, the risk is confusion. People start mixing up fact and fan fiction until the lines blur completely. But isn't there also a staggering gain hiding in that chaos? Think about it. People who would never in a million years have cared about ancient Mesopotamia are suddenly Googling cuneiform at 2 a.m, arguing over the difference between Sumerian and Akkadian, like it's the season finale of their favorite show. A curious viewer who showed up for a wild tale about lost extraterrestrial knowledge might actually stick around long enough to discover why a 360-day calendar plus 5 scary epigomenal days mattered so desperately to a farmer praying the barley wouldn't flood. They might even learn how the ancients kept canal roster duty fair, because nobody wants to dig silt while their neighbour naps. Or what it felt like to swear a solemn oath by the names of the old High Court and know that gods were listening. If the only downside is that some poor museum guard has to smile through yet another breathless question about a hidden planet nobody can find, honestly, is that really too high a price to pay? The journey from total obscurity to pop culture stardom has left the Anunnaki living this fascinating double life, hasn't it? On one side, they remain exactly who they always were, the ancient elders who inscribed destinies onto clay tablets with a stylus, the solemn assembly that sits in judgment beneath the earth when our time is up. On the other side, they've become these shimmering symbols that modern creators, novelists, game designers, YouTubers reach for whenever they want to signal instant depth, instant mystery, instant, whoa, this just got real. The first version is anchored forever in baked clay, mud brick temples, and the long green memory of a river valley that birthed writing itself. The second version floats weightless in an endless sea of glowing screens, changing shape every time someone hits remix. And you know what? Both versions are probably here to stay, because the old stories are the most generous hosts imaginable, and modern culture is perpetually starving for a bigger stage. Want to see how a 21st century society actually wrestles with stories that are 4,000 or 5,000 years old? Try this experiment. Visit 3 places in a single afternoon and watch the magic happen. Start in a quiet university seminar room where an Assyriologist with chalk-stained fingers writes wedge after wedge on a whiteboard and, get this, explains how rotating a single sign just a quarter turn can flip its entire meaning. Mind-blowing, right? Then walk over to the planetarium, take a seat under that vast dome, and let an astronomer fill the ceiling with thousands of tracked objects, while calmly proving why any rogue wandering world would announce itself decades, even centuries, before it ever swung close enough to ruin your day. Finally, slip into a museum conservation lab, where a specialist, wearing gloves and the patience of a saint, teases a brand new line of cuneiform out of a cracked tablet, using nothing but a soft brush and a raking light. In the space between those 3 rooms, you'll watch a myth get put through rigorous scrutiny, not to crush it flat, but to discover its proper, breathtaking size. Academic skepticism always starts with language, doesn't it? Those ancient words aren't tidy little puzzles you solve once and then lock away in a display case. They're living, breathing things that shift meaning depending on the era, the city, even the mood of the scribe having a bad day. Take Nibiru in the late Babylonian star lists. Sometimes it's just a crossing point in the sky, sometimes a planet used as a seasonal marker, but never, ever a secret extra world playing hide-and-seek behind the sun. The word Anunnaki does the exact same dance. In early Sumerian hymns, it's the shining high council decreeing destinies from above. In later first millennium incantations, it's the terrifying bench of judges down below. Neither version is talking about a colony of gold miners from deep space. These aren't opinions, friends. These are conclusions hammered out across tens of thousands of tablets, read in careful sequence by generations of scholars who trained themselves to ask, what does this term mean right here in this actual text? Instead of, what would sound coolest in my argument? Philology has this quiet, elegant grace to it, doesn't it? A scholar lines up parallel passages side by side, and suddenly you see the exact same phrase about mixing clay with the blood of a god, appearing in one context about the sacred birth of cult statues, and in another about the miraculous gift of speech. The point is never to sneer at anyone's imaginative reading, never. The point is to prove that ancient authors were working inside rich, traceable traditions. A line that sits comfortably next to a hymn on one tablet and a purification ritual on another doesn't magically transform into a secret lab report just because somebody moved it into a glossy coffee table book. Good skepticism isn't cruelty. It's fierce loyalty to the sources. Archaeology swoops in next and plants solid ground beneath every word. Excavations at places like Uruk, Nippur and Babylon keep uncovering layer after layer of rebuilding cities, literally rising on the bones of their ancestors. You find ancient river courses that shifted overnight and drowned entire neighborhoods, rooms stuffed with the everyday gear of real human life. Grinding stones, children's toys, jars of barley beer. Foundation deposits under brand new temple walls contain tiny figurines and prayers begging the old high court to protect the construction work. Boundary stones out in the fields summon that same court to rain curses on anyone greedy enough to nudge a marker 1 inch. Suddenly, it makes perfect sense why the gods are constantly asked to watch over canals and enforce property lines, because those were the things that kept society from collapsing. But do any of those digs turn up a secret hangar or a concrete landing pad? Not a single one. And if someone still wants to argue for spaceships hiding in the marshes, the very least they could do is produce one alien bolt, one shard of exotic alloy the region had never seen before. Guess how many have appeared after a century and a half of digging? 0. Not one. Astronomy slams the gate shut on the grandest modern claims with a polite but firm hand. Our solar system isn't some mysterious frontier anymore. It's a neighborhood that's been mapped by professionals working 80-hour weeks and by passionate hobbyists who think losing sleep under a dark sky is the best night ever. Large bodies simply cannot hide. They tug on the planets we already track. They glow in infrared surveys, like neon signs. And their orbits can be simulated on a laptop in your bedroom and then double-checked against what we actually see through backyard telescopes. When someone breathlessly predicts that a hidden giant is about to swoop past Earth and end civilization, astronomers don't laugh, they measure. And when the measurements come back empty, they publish the results and move on to the next wonder. The real sky doesn't need extra drama to be jaw-dropping. It already gives us comets that shed tails like chalk dust across black velvet, planets whose moons eclipse in patterns so perfect you could set your watch to them. Scientists and scholars also keep a watchful eye on how ideas themselves spread, because that's a science too. Claims about a dangerous rogue object with no coordinates follow a pattern as old as time. The doomsday date keeps sliding forward every time the calendar page turns and nothing happens. The evidence is always one friend of a friend layer removed. My buddy knows a guy who worked at a secret facility and saw something they can't show anyone. In those moments, the calm, kind response is always an invitation. Come look through my telescope tonight. Come browse a public sky survey online. Come learn how orbits actually work. And you know what? A general audience can grasp the essentials of celestial mechanics way faster than most people think. Once you understand why a long-period giant planet would have battered the inner solar system for billions of years already, you stop expecting it to suddenly tiptoe past us in a single season like some cosmic ninja. None of this, not one bit, makes the old stories feel small. The flood epic isn't a literal weather report, but it's a gut-wrenching way to remember the terrifying truth of living in a delta where the river could shift its bed overnight and erase an entire generation. The creation of humanity to carry baskets isn't a genetic engineering lab scene. It's raw, honest testimony about the back-breaking labor and ration lines that built civilization. The descent of Inanna to the underworld doesn't come with GPS coordinates, but it gives aching shape to grief and explains why families still poured out beer for their dead when the new moon rose. A myth keeps its wisdom precisely when we let it stay where it belongs, rooted in real human experience. You can actually measure the health of an academic field by how joyfully it handles disagreement and Assyriology. It's surprisingly cheerful. Editors rush to publish brand new collations that correct century-old readings. A tablet that everyone thought said one thing for decades suddenly reveals a different story when a long-lost corner is pieced back in. Arguments unfold in footnotes with a dry humour that barely hides the white-hot passion for getting a single line exactly right. Even the big-picture conclusions keep evolving. 100 years ago, scholars wrote about rigid, unchanging pantheons. Today, they talk about fluid divine households that shifted from city to city and century to century, which makes the journey of a name like Anunnaki from sky to underworld feel even richer, even more alive. There's this profound lesson in humility baked right into the tablets themselves. Clay is fragile one accidental elbow, and it shatters. Yet it outlasts bronze, iron, even empires. A temple catches fire, and the intense heat accidentally bakes its library hard as brick. A flood topples a wall and seals an accounting room where a clerk stacked loan tablets on his final day. When we read what that clerk wrote 4,000 years ago, we're not just learning about gods. We're watching human beings in a harsh landscape invent systems that still echo in our lives. Scribes invented a way to number time that still governs our months. Surveyors set boundary stones that outlasted dynasties. Priests created interlocking calendars that moved entire populations in perfect step. Those achievements stand tall, whether or not anyone ever looked down on us from another world. So the legacy of the Anunnaki in our modern world is this beautiful double thread, isn't it? On one strand, the name is a priceless teaching tool that lures students toward the first cities, the first ledgers, the first desperate attempts to write justice into law. On the other strand, the name has become a blank canvas for brand new stories that reveal our own anxieties, our own dreams, our own cosmic loneliness. Both strands are going to keep weaving themselves into the future. One stays firmly anchored to clay tablets and meticulous reading. The other drifts free and changes colour with every passing decade. Maybe the endurance of the ancient term depends on that very flexibility. Maybe a living culture simply can't help finding new uses for an old label, even when the original owners would barely recognise the role we've cast them in. What matters above all is that we keep the categories crystal clear. When a museum label tells you that a tablet is a hymn to Enlil, originally composed in Sumerian and carefully copied in Akkadian, that is hard-won knowledge earned through blood, sweat, and decades in dusty basements. When a late-night host breathlessly claims that same hymn is a veiled technical manual for an alien machine, that's theatre brilliant, entertaining theatre. Enjoy the show, applaud the performance, but please, please don't slip it into the footnotes section of a scholarly article. The ancient authors deserve that basic respect. They built an entire world in words that explained why cities rise and fall, why labour has to be shared, why promises must bind us across generations. They imagined a high council that fixed destinies from above, and later pictured that same council as a stern bench of judges below. Honestly, that's quite enough grandeur for any single tradition, don't you think? If you want one final perfect test of how myth and science can sit side by side without ever quarrelling, go back to the planetarium after dark. The guide dims the lights until the room disappears, then conjures the spring night sky exactly as it appeared above the lower rivers 4,000 years ago. The constellations look both alien and comfortingly familiar. The moon rises in silver silence. A glowing line traces the path Jupiter would have followed that season. The guide quietly recites an ancient omen. If the bright god shines while the wind blows from the south, expect a good harvest. Then, without missing a beat, the guide explains how that very same planet loops backward against the stars, because Earth is lapping it in our faster orbit around the sun. And no one in the dome feels cheated, not for a second. The old omen and the new explanation fit together as perfectly as an offering bowl nestled inside a brick shrine. The Anunnaki still hold their ancient seat in human memory. The sky still pours out its unbearable beauty. And we, lucky, curious, meaning-hungry creatures that we are, still have room for both. Walk into a quiet room where a single clay tablet rests alone on its stand, and suddenly the distance between us and the first cities collapses to nothing. The wedge marks are small, tidy, almost shy. A list of barley and dates, a soaring hymn, a king boasting about his new temple. Somewhere behind those marks stands a priest who counted loaves at dawn, a scribe who copied the same line over and over until it sang. Out of that plain, everyday material, the people of the lower rivers built an entire map of the unseen world and credited it to the work of the Anunnaki. It explained why days had shape, why rulers needed limits, why destinies were spoken in a court that floated far above human squabbles. It was intensely practical spirituality, and it proved astonishingly durable. Those old stories are not random legends haphazardly stacked like Jenga blocks waiting to topple. They form a single, breathtakingly coherent system. And it all begins with one foundational act that still echoes every time we look up at night. The separation of sky and earth that gave the world its very first structure. The great council of the high gods, the Anunnaki themselves, sit in solemn assembly and set fates in motion so that kingship actually means something, and the calendar carries real, heart-pounding weight. Can you feel the gravity of that moment? When they decree who rules, and when the seasons turn, it's not some distant cosmic game. It's the very rhythm that lets a city breathe, lets a farmer sleep at night, knowing the floodwaters will, hopefully, wait until after harvest. And then, oh wow, the creation of human beings steps in to solve the most practical crisis imaginable. The gods are exhausted from digging canals and hauling baskets themselves, so they make us, yes us, to shoulder the load and keep the whole miraculous system running. Doesn't that flip every fairy tale you ever heard on its head? We weren't born just to dance under the stars. We were born because someone had to keep the irrigation ditches clear and the temple granaries full, and suddenly the social order, the canal rosters, the daily ration of barley bread and beer, all of it makes heartbreaking sense. Then comes the flood-terrifying world ending, the moment when growth has pushed the land past its patience and everything gets washed away in a roar of water and regret. But listen, after the devastation, after the absolute horror, there's a promise whispered on the wind. Life will continue, narrower now, hemmed in by new limits, but it will continue. And the descent to the realm of the dead? Inanna, stripping away her jewels gate by gate until she hangs naked on a hook? That's not just drama. It's the raw instruction manual for how grief works, how you survive it when someone you love vanishes into the dust. If the living will only remember the names, pour out a little beer, speak aloud under the new moon, then grief can be managed, carried, even transformed into something bearable. Every single one of these episodes solves a real problem that every city, every family, every trembling human heart has always faced, and then turns that solution into a story so beautiful you can sing it at festivals or whisper it alone in a lamplit room when the night feels too big. When we say mythology, don't we usually picture a fluffy cloud of pure fancy, pretty gods throwing thunderbolts for fun? In Mesopotamia, it was also, get this, a handbook, a practical, no-nonsense guide to surviving on a flood-prone plain between two unpredictable rivers. Those mysterious me that Inanna steals or bargains for, they're not just poetic ornaments glittering in an epic. They're the actual catalogue of powers that make a city function, the secret of the plough, the magic of weaving, the sacred knowledge of truth-telling and kingship itself. And the Anunnaki, they are never a chaotic parade of divine mood swings. They are the council, the steady, solemn board of directors who guarantee that decisions echo across generations, not just across a single dramatic afternoon. Even in the grandest cosmic moments, you can almost hear the scratch of a Clark stylus tallying what must be recorded, measured, remembered. When Inanna sails home triumphant in her boat of heaven, do you realize what she's actually bringing back? Real institutions, laws, courts, crafts, the whole scaffolding of civilization. When a weathered boundary stone out in a field dares anyone to move it and calls on the high court of the Anunnaki to rain down curses on the thief, that's not empty threat. It's protecting the harvest that keeps an entire village alive. No wonder this mythology traveled like wildfire. Traders tucked the stories in their packs and carried them upriver. Conquerors swooped in, saw something that worked, and repackaged the whole pantheon for their brand new capitals. Scribes, bless their meticulous hearts, kept adapting the cast as duties shifted across centuries. The Hittites looked at those elder gods and thought, yeah, we'll lock them downstairs and let the younger generation run things. The Babylonians promoted their city god Marduk to CEO and gave him the cosmic task of setting the sky in measurable, predictable paths talk about a promotion. And the Hebrews, living right there within earshot of the same rivers, took the bones of the old flood story, kept the terror and the rainbow promise, and set it inside a radically new frame. One God, one covenant, one unbreakable relationship. These motifs crossed languages the way caravans cross deserts effortlessly, because every society, every single one, has to wrestle with the exact same questions. Who does the work? Who gets the power? What do we do when catastrophe hits? How do we handle unbearable loss? Isn't it exhilarating to watch a modern reader hop from one tradition to another and suddenly realize myth isn't a cage? It's a laboratory where cultures test answers to the same eternal questions in different rooms. Why does power belong to some and not to others? Have you ever asked yourself that at 3 a.m.? Suma looks you dead in the eye and says, the office literally descends from heaven and gets its stamp of approval in a sacred city like Nippur. Babylon counters with, the God who rebuilds the shattered world after the flood earns the right to rule everything else. Performance-based leadership. Israel steps in and says no. Power belongs only to the one creator who binds every king to justice and never ever forgets the poor. The argument stretches across centuries, and the astonishing thing, it stays completely civil on the page, polite, passionate, profound. There's this gorgeous pleasure in how concrete Mesopotamian myth stays, even when it's talking about the edges of the universe. Ziggurats aren't abstract ladders to nowhere. They're actual mountains of brick built, so a sacred procession can be seen from every corner of the city. A calendar isn't some mystical diagram. It's the schedule that tells you exactly when to open the canal gates, when to sow the barley, when to harvest so nobody starves, and people chant it together so everyone shows up on the same day. Omens don't turn people into puppets. They train eyes to look outward at sky and wind and river, so decisions are made with care instead of panic. The Anunnaki sit high above it all, yes, but they never, ever float away from the dusty streets where millstones grind, where barges nose carefully through narrow locks, where real children laugh and real widows weep. If you dare ask what gives these myths their unbelievable staying power, the answer hits you like sunrise. They keep their feet planted firmly on the ground while their eyes stay locked on the horizon. They look the perilous world right in the face and say, yes, it's dangerous out there, but the best we can do is share the burdens, keep our promises, and do it all in front of witnesses who will outlast every one of us. They give fate a name, but they leave spacious room for argument, for mercy, for a clever God who hunts for humane paths whenever the rules start to chafe. They praise order without pretending order is free. Someone has to shovel the silt. Someone has to sing the lament when the city falls. And the stories don't dodge those tasks. They stand up and honor them with tears and pride. They acknowledge limits without sliding into despair. Mortality shows up after the flood, not just as punishment, but as a boundary that suddenly makes society bearable. The afterlife is no glittering paradise, yet the living can still comfort the dead with bread and beer and spoken names. Kings can boast until their lungs give out, but every single tablet that records a royal land grant also begs the highest court of the Anunnaki to punish any future king who cheats, which is the quiet, clay-baked confession that even the mightiest power needs breaks. A tradition that says all of that out loud isn't just ancient, it's staggeringly mature. And when the Anunnaki stride into our modern imagination wearing spacesuits or secret patron robes, aren't we just watching the same human move we've always made? We grab an elder symbol of order and stretch it to fit our brand new anxieties, sometimes playfully, sometimes lazily, always because the name still carries that electric charge of awe. A writer drops Anunnaki into a sentence, and every reader instantly feels the stakes skyrocket, even if they can't explain why. But the deeper, truer use is to let the old idea do the job it was born for. Treat Anunnaki as the High Council in a universe that actually runs on rules. Rules that even the greatest cities have to honor or perish. Read a soaring hymn to Enlil, then pull up the city plan of Nippur and trace with your finger where ordinary people brought their petitions. Feel the hairs on your neck stand up. Read the flood story until your eyes sting. Then stare at the thick silt band in an archaeological trench at Ur and realize real people once watched that same water swallow their world. Read a boundary stone curse that promises boiling oil and scorpions for anyone who moves the marker. Then walk along a modern levee at dusk and feel in your bones why a line on the ground can matter more than life itself. These myths were never meant to help us escape reality. They were forged to bind reality together with clear, unflinching language and unbreakable shared memory. And here's one final way these stories feel shockingly modern. They teach transparency like it's the air we breathe. Decisions have to be spoken out loud in public. Oaths have to name every witness divine and human, so nobody can pretend they didn't hear. Rituals have to be regular, visible, repeatable, so trust can grow. You could almost say the invention of accountability begins right here, in clay, in the insistence that a fate is never a private whim. It's a decree that can be heard, weighed, argued about in the open. When later cultures invent written law codes and public festivals, they're building on ground the first cities already stamped with wedge-shaped honesty. So when you finally stand in that hushed museum room and the single small tablet on its stand looks almost shy, remember what is actually contained inside those tidy rows of wedges. A rock-solid belief that time itself can be counted and trusted. A conviction that work is a sacred shared trust. A bone-deep fear of flood and famine balanced by the stubborn, breathtaking faith that order can return if cities rebuild and gods forgive. And a name, the Anunnaki, for the council that guarantees words still have weight 4,000 years later. They survive not because they're glamorous, though heavens they can be, but because the world still aches for what they represent. Strip away the gold masks, roll up the painted reliefs, set aside the thundering titles, and what's left? The same worries and hopes we carry today: rain in season, children who survive childhood, work that matters, a fair hearing when everything goes wrong. The entire Anunnaki myth cycle is one long, gorgeous conversation about exactly those things. A human story determined to make the unpredictable bearable and the ordinary feel worthy of ceremony. Start with work, because that's where the earliest poems always start. And they never lie. Irrigation is brutal. Someone has to carry the baskets, and pretending otherwise is fantasy. But then, here's the twist. They give that crushing burden a cosmic frame. If humanity was created precisely to take up the tasks the gods could no longer stomach, then toil isn't a mistake. It's a founding choice. Stern, yes, but also weirdly comforting. The farmer sweating on the levee at noon can suddenly imagine himself inside a plan that began before memory itself began. The temple ration list isn't just cold bookkeeping, its participation in the original compact sealed with clay and divine blood, and meaning arrives in a simple bowl of beer, counted out by a clerk who actually knows your name. Move to law, and watch the habit of swearing oaths by the High Court turn justice into something stronger than any king's mood. When a scribe buries a tablet under a boundary stone and calls the Anunnaki to witness, he's tying a local quarrel to the oldest authority in existence. And he's protecting strangers who aren't even born yet. That's a small, breathtaking miracle of foresight. The beginning of a tradition that says the dead and the unborn both have claims the living ignore at their peril. Consider grief real, aching grief. The Mesopotamian afterlife is dim, dusty, spare, yet the living refuse to let it be lonely. They pour beer through a libation pipe, set out bread, speak names aloud so the shades feel less forgotten. And the Anunnaki, stern judges below, become the guarantee that stories don't end in a ditch. A life is weighed, a wrong is marked, a right still counts. When a family keeps the monthly rites, they're insisting connection survives even the great river of death. In a world without antibiotics or helicopters, that insistence is nothing less than a humane triumph. Think about power kings swagger through the text dripping gold and glory, but underneath every parade runs a rule sharp enough to cut them down. Kingship is only a loan. It descends from above, and it can be revoked the moment legitimacy walks out the temple door. The Anunnaki in their bright upper court are the ultimate board that can stand up and say, enough, call it mythology if you want. But it feels a lot like the birth of constitutional thought baked into clay instead of written on parchment. Watch how the stories train attention outward. Omens teach people to look at moon rings and wind direction not to freeze in fear, but to gather information before acting. Today we call it risk management. The Anunnaki frame turned careful observation into policy by claiming the universe sends consistent signals if you're willing to read them. The method may be wrong by our science, but the posture, admirable, brave, wise, and finally, feel the steady tenderness for craft that runs through everything. Enki cheering on clever hands, Ninhursag blessing everything well made, the me ranking weaving, carpentry, music, brewing right alongside truth and victory, because those skills are what keep a city alive and worth living in. A boat builder who caulks a perfect seam is an agent of divine order. A singer who remembers the exact lament keeps a whole community honest about loss. There is a lesson about limits, woven through it all, that feels not bleak, but bracing like cool water on a burning day. Yes, the world is perilous. Yes, we will die, but look what we can build, what we can share, what we can still sing while we're here. And here's the part that always stops me cold after the flood, when the waters finally pull back and the mud starts to dry. The great council of the Anunnaki doesn't slam the door on humanity out of spite. No, they shorten our lives, yes, but listen to this. They do it not to punish us, but to keep the world from choking on its own success. Can you even wrap your head around that? This is ecological thinking 2,000 years before anyone coined the word sustainability. The gods look down, see cities swelling, canals sprawling, population exploding, and they say, enough. We love this experiment too much to let it collapse under its own weight. They set a ceiling on human years the same way. A modern city sets water rations or carbon caps, so the whole beautiful system can keep breathing. modern ears hear ration books and falling water tables. The ancients heard the earth itself finally getting rest, and the gods finally getting sleep again. Either way, the message rings out like a bell across 4,000 years. Enough can be a virtue. Too much can kill the very thing you love most. Isn't that one of the most grown-up ideas any culture has ever dared to speak out loud? And don't you dare think these myths hand us simple, shiny virtue either. Oh no, they refuse to make goodness easy. Enlil stands there like the stern father of authority itself. And sometimes, let's be honest, he swings the axe way too hard, flooding the world because the noise of humanity kept him awake. Enki, bless his clever heart, stands for mercy and trickster wisdom, bending rules like reeds in the wind just to save a single life he's grown fond of. Inanna, she's desire and ambition on fire. She'll build you the most dazzling city you've ever seen, then turn around and start a war because someone looked at her wrong. And Utu, the sun god, the blazing eye of justice, gets asked to read hearts the way he reads clay tablets. Nothing escapes that gaze. These are not cartoon gods in sparkling capes. These are unflinching, full-colour portraits of what it means to be powerful and flawed at the same time. No impulse is pure, no character gets off easy, and the reader, ancient or modern, learns the hard, gorgeous lesson that balance is everything, and any single quality that claims to rule alone is headed for disaster. Zoom in closer. Come on. Really lean in, and suddenly you're standing in sun-baked courtyards, watching ordinary miracles the myths never forget to bless. There's a brewer skimming foam off fresh beer, tipping the first cup onto the earth with a quiet thank you to the god who taught fermentation. A canal crew collapses in the shade, passing dates and warm flatbread, laughing for 5 precious minutes before the foreman claps and the basket chain starts its drumbeat rhythm again. Lift, swing, dump, lift, swing, dump, like a heartbeat keeping the whole land alive. A shepherd calls his flock down from the levee in that sing-song voice only sheep understand, while a scribe stands ready with stylus and clay to count every woolly head. A midwife dips a cool cloth, while a nervous family murmurs the hymn to Nintu, the mother of all living, praying the new life arrives screaming and perfect. When the High Council smiles on the city for a season, it's these tasks, these sweaty, sacred, everyday tasks that suddenly feel lighter, almost sung. Myth doesn't just tell these stories, it frames them, sanctifies them, hands them a thank you that echoes for centuries. Even war gets dragged inside the circle of rules instead of being let loose like a wild dog. Before a single spear is lifted, kings tremble in front of omens and priests, making lavish offerings, swearing on their lives they'll spare temples and holy places. When the season of killing finally ends, they hang the weapons on the wall and throw a festival so big the whole city gets to exhale and remember it's still one people. The Anunnaki don't pretend violence can be banned. They domesticate it, leash it, demand that power answer to expectation and tradition. If that sounds naive, just look around. How many modern nations still invent parades and medals and welcome home ceremonies to shepherd soldiers back into civilian skin and stitch a torn country together again? We never outgrew the need for those rituals, did we? And mercy sweet stubborn mercy threads through every hard line like gold wire through rough cloth. the flood ends not with a divine fist pump of victory, but with regret. With sorrowful gods wiping their eyes and drawing up a brand new plan. Inanna claws her way back from the underworld through a negotiated substitute rules bend, but they don't break, and life gets to keep rolling. Even the nastiest boundary stone curse, the ones that promise boiling oil and blindness to anyone who moves the marker, almost always slip in a hopeful line. But if any future king restores what was broken, may the gods heap blessings on him. Mercy refuses to be edited out, because people cannot live on lore alone any more than they can live on bread alone. You could be forgiven for thinking a council of gods belongs to dusty museums and childhood storybooks. Then you wake up, look around, and realize how much of our own lives still dances to that ancient rhythm. Companies gather in glass-walled boardrooms and decree futures that will ripple across thousands of lives for decades. Courts sit in solemn rows and hand down judgments that feel eerily like destinies. We still build calendars that tell us when to plant, when to pay taxes, when to gather with family, when to rest, and we treat those dates like sacred law. We keep ledgers and expect total strangers on the other side of the planet to honor them. We pour one out for absent friends, speak names at graves, light candles on birthdays of people who've been gone for years, secretly hoping someone, somewhere, is keeping score of what was fair and what was cruel. The labels have changed. CEO instead of king, constitution instead of omen. But the habits are family. What the Anunnaki finally offer isn't a suitcase of exotic images. It's a bridge, a breathtaking living bridge between human scale and cosmic scale. They make it possible to believe that a humble loaf of barley bread left in a side chapel in the majestic path of Jupiter across a whole month both belong to the exact same order. They let a farmer whisper a prayer at dusk, and a scribe carve a law in stone, and both acts carry real weight because both are heard in places that outlast any single lifetime. That belief steadied people who lived at the mercy of fickle rivers and cruel kings. Can it steady us too if we're brave enough to translate the language with care? Because the human story behind the Anunnaki isn't really about gods at all. It's about the raw, trembling choice to live as if words still matter, as if shared work is holy, as if limits are actually a gift, and as if memory can bind the living and the dead tighter than any chain. The first cities took those choices and pinned them to clay with a stylus, and those tiny tablets, some no bigger than your palm, are still talking, still singing, still refusing to shut up after 4,000 years. Want to know if the Anunnaki are just pretty words? Then grab a map, buy a plane ticket, and go where their names first made sense, because this story has addresses. It breathes in river silt and the smell of rain on baked brick. Start way down south at Eridu, where the Persian Gulf once lapped against low ground like a cat at a bowl. This is where the Sumerians said Enki, lord of sweet waters, cleverness and fresh starts, kept his house right at the magical seam where river kisses sea. Archaeologists dug down through layer after layer of temples, each one built proudly on the ruins of the older, like chapters carefully placed on a shelf. Each altar a little bigger, each floor plan a little bolder. Stand there at sunset with reeds whispering in the breeze and you'll feel it in your bones. Wisdom itself lives at the margin where worlds touch. Head north and suddenly the great ziggurat of Ur rises from the plain like it's daring the desert to try again. Woolley cleared those stairways a century ago, and found the royal tombs nearby. Gold headdresses, lapis beads, carnelian necklaces, lyres still strung with silver, gaming boards ready for one last match, carts and oxen poised to carry queens into eternity. You can almost see the funeral procession in your mind, musicians leading, attendants in feather crowns, the queen descending into a chamber furnished like she's just stepping out for the evening. The message is heartbreakingly clear. The underworld needs beauty and civility too. When hymns talk about the Anunnaki judges below, remember they were written by people who packed a lamp, a cup, and a friend for the road. Uruk still sprawls across the landscape like a small country, too proud to apologize. Districts for Inanna and Anu. Platforms big enough to hold crowds whose voices would roll like surf across sun-scorched brick. This is where writing was born, and the very first argument about what a city is actually for exploded into being. Walk the mounds today, and you can almost hear the click, click, click of styluses and the creak of carts loaded with barley in narrow, mud-walled lanes. When the epic says, Inanna sailed home with the gifts of civilization, Uruk is the city she made worthy of that cargo-loud, messy, glorious Uruk. Nippur looks almost modest from the highway, just tangled mounds with baked brick peeking through like shy secrets. But this was Enlil's seat, the place where kings crawled on their knees to beg for the right to rule. The Eka precinct is the Cosmic Council's actual floor plan. Courts, storerooms, stairways, altars, a working campus where incense and petitions rose together, and clay tablets zip between offices like memos. Pace those ruins, and the idea that the Anunnaki decreed destiny suddenly feels solid enough to lean on. Lagash lies in the flatlands like a book someone forgot to close. Here, a reformer king carved the first known legal reforms, because he was sick of officials bullying widows and orphans. The tablets from Lagash have the sharp bite of minutes from a tense city council meeting, fishing rights, ration theft, corruption exposed in daylight. The High Council mattered here because someone had to draw a line when the strong decided the weak were disposable. Kish stands like a northern sentinel, earth still the colour of sun-dried tea after all these centuries. The king list gives it the first crown after the flood, and armies marched past its fields for millennia on their way to quarrels we only know from broken lines. A frontier city learns to love documents and learns exactly which gods to call when a throne falls, but a promise still needs to stand. Shurapak gives you chills for a different reason. This is the city later stories, named as the home of the flood hero. Excavations turned up a thick band of clean river clay right where people's floors used to be. A catastrophic inundation around 2900 BCE that ended a generation's dreams in one muddy roar. Hold that clay in your hand, then read the flood myth again, and suddenly the Anunnaki's decision to hit reset doesn't sound like fantasy. It sounds like traumatized poets trying to make sense of a world that drowned overnight. Across the Tigris looms Assur, the city that would name an empire. Its god Assur calmly took up roles once played by older southern powers, and palaces rose with cool corridors, lined with reliefs of lion hunts and conquered enemies. Scribes kept omen lists because even conquerors want to believe victories are more than luck. The Anunnaki still appear in the records here, folded into a wider ledger that tracks campaigns, and the seating chart of defeated gods. On a graceful bend of the Euphrates sits Mari River Hub, palace of 1,000 rooms. Archives so stuffed with letters they spilled onto the floor. Tablets record. Kings firing off gifts and threats. Governors whining about barley shortfalls. Priests reporting eclipses and malformed sheep livers. The Anunnaki show up as the shared password that let one city trust another city's oath. Myth became policy the moment it moved grain and soldiers. Nineveh and Nimrod pull you into the fabulous libraries of Ashurbanipal shelves packed with the Epic of Gilgamesh, ritual instructions, star catalogues, everything hoarded with a passion that still takes your breath away. When the kings who carved dying lions also copied the songs of older priests, they were admitting the words still worked. The Anunnaki outlived the cities that first spoke their name because someone kept copying the tablets. And then there is Babylon, the city that looked at every map and said, "Not the center yet? Hold my beer." The processional way sliced through walls, faced with glazed brick the color of midnight sky. The Ishtar Gate roared with dragons and bulls that meant serious cosmic business was happening inside. In the temple quarter, the New Year rites tied calendar to kingship and marched Marduk to the head of a pantheon that still tipped its hat to the older family. When Babylonian lists divide the Anunnaki into those of heaven and those of earth, you can almost hear the accountants smiling. Everything tallied, scheduled, measured, glorious. The story isn't only under the ground, it lives in museum cases and drawers too. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad guards riches that tell the whole sweeping arc from prehistoric pots to tablets that still name the high gods. The British Museum keeps the famous flood tablet that made George Smith leap from his chair in 1872, shouting in Victorian ecstasy, because he'd just found Noah before Noah. The Louvre still locks eyes with stone kings who stare out like they fully expect to be obeyed even now. Stand anywhere in this long chain of cities, squint against the sun, breathe the dust, and you'll feel it. The Anunnaki never left. They just changed clothes. They're still the voice that says words matter. Work is sacred when it's shared. Limits are a gift. And memory is the only immortality we ever really get. The rivers still flow. The bricks still smell like rain. And somewhere a council older than empires is still keeping the books on what we do with the years we're given. And honestly, that feels less like ancient history and a lot more like right now. Berlin's museums keep this one gate that still shines like it remembers the sun of 5,000 years ago. Can you believe that? You walk from room to room and it feels like you're drifting down the same slow river of things. A little clay boat offered to a god, a contract scratched on a tablet, a king's plea for one more good year. Every object started as somebody's hope or record, and somehow ended up an ambassador speaking for people who never dreamed we'd still be listening. What hits you hardest really stops you in your tracks is how stubbornly the gods and stories cling to the dirt they were born in. Why does the Sweetwater god belong at Eridu? Because without fresh water, the whole plain dies. Simple as that. Why does the council that decides destinies meet at Nippur? Because every frightened city sent its prayers there, begging, "Remember us." And those grim judges of the underworld, they make perfect sense when you picture families lowering lamps into graves and whispering the names of the dead so they won't be forgotten. The Anunnaki aren't cloudy ideas floating in some philosopher's head. They're job titles shaped by real people who dug canals, counted barley, swore oaths under open sky, and hoped like hell the harvest would come. You start to feel the weight of method too. Archaeologists on their knees, troweling millimetre by millimetre, logging every potsherd like priests writing scripture because an object ripped from its home can lie its head off. A broken tablet pulled from a trash heap beside the temple kitchen can teach you more about what people actually offered the gods than some perfect specimen sitting pretty in a dealer's glass case. Out in the field, survey teams spot ancient canal lines from the air, then walk every bend in spring to see which ones still sweat moisture. Somebody tests a brick for salt, and suddenly you understand why an entire neighborhood turned to ghost town overnight. Patient, stubborn, glorious work, and out of it rises a clearer picture of why those ancient people made the choices they did. You almost want to reach back and say, I see you, I get it now. Then there's the land itself, still breathing. Down south, the marshes came back. Can you imagine the joy? And with them, the old look of reed boats gliding between water buffalo while dragonflies flash like jewels. Farmers still tease wheat and barley from soil so salty it sparkles at noon. Pilgrims and guards still climb ziggurat steps at sunset, watching wind comb dust across the horizon exactly the way it did when the world was new. A story that began 5,000 years ago borrows its colours from this afternoon's light. How is that not magic? Lay the map on the table, put your finger on each glowing city name, and the whole epic clicks together without a single forced word. There's the family of the sky, born straight out of the flat, fierce plain. There's the council chamber where a trembling king asks for one more year of favour. There's the court far below where judges listen while a priest reads the names of the newly dead in that slow ritual voice that still raises goosebumps. The Anunnaki are the spine holding the whole map upright. Follow that spine and you can walk from the very first shrine on a lonely sandspit to the library corner where a schoolboy practiced copying the line about the flood that washed the world clean. Step back, blink, and the pattern is almost embarrassingly simple. The Anunnaki were the grammar of a civilization that refused to drown in restless water. Cities chose patron gods, set calendars, swore oaths, and had to trust that a high court was listening. Empires rose and rewrote the org chart. Empires fell and the names just moved into libraries that outlasted every wall. Later storytellers borrowed the word for wild new tales, but the heart stayed the same. A promise that work, law, memory, and fate can be spoken plainly and kept. The story ends where it began, on the plain, always the plain. A ziggurat step, warm under Sunday sun. A canal, bend, thick with green reeds. A tablet, still carrying the faint thumbprint of the scribe who pressed it while the clay was wet. The voices are gone, yes, but the system they built is still perfectly readable. And if you listen, really listen, it says, count carefully. Share the load. Respect the boundaries. Leave room for mercy. That's not ancient theology whispering across the centuries. That's a manual for living together, handed to us on a shining gate that somehow, impossibly, still remembers the light. you.